Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polities Podcast. We have another episode of Good Soil. I am here with the Doughertys. Sean, Beth, good to see you both.
Nice to be here.
One of the things that we've gotten several complaints about, and I'm sure you're very used to this given the career you've chosen for yourself, which is evangelists for dirt and such, is, okay, I've heard it. I get how this is political movement. I get how this is valuable. But what about me? I am stuck in the city. Here I am, covered in concrete. They just plowed right over me, and I'm part of the sidewalk now. And I have either no space or very little space in which to garden. And certainly, you can't be saying that something like a garden is what, when we listen to you, you're talking about the cow, you're talking about the ruminants, you're talking about the restoration of land, if it's been strip mined, giving it new topsoil. None of which is possible, last I checked anyways, in our city. We cannot have a cow.
There are laws.
Yeah. So today I just wanted to spend some time talking about gardens, because whether we like it or not, I think most people are only in the position, realistically, to garden. Now, you have spoken, I think, very movingly to people that actually could take that 2 acres.
Right.
And I think it's people... Because
one of the things that we say is within 5 miles of where you are, there is some abandoned land that you could do something with. Right. But you're in the city, you're not going to do that. We still think it's really...
If you own land, I mean, you start where you are, even including maybe, your balcony of your apartment.
Right.
Before you go looking for the 2 acres you're going to take over, there are things you can be doing. Sean has a step 0 in our 10 steps to building an independent farmstead, and step 0 is what you do when you're still in the apartment.
Right. And we're also going to be speaking for the St. Basil Institute. We're going to give a talk for that. And one of the things we're going to talk about is the mandate that God gave to man. That this is what we're supposed to do. We are not supposed to proxy out every bit of eating that we do. Right. That we should have a responsibility to do that, and taking that responsibility may lead to another step.
Yeah, right.
Yes, we think that it was a really good thing to do, even if you're only doing container gardens on your balcony.
I thought of this from a new angle recently, because I've been thinking about how Jesus was a carpenter, and thinking about the significance of Jesus Christ as a tradesman. Someone who's being commissioned to do various jobs and who knows wood from the inside, as it were. Like he understands how everything hangs together, the table, the chair, and then eventually the cross. I mean, he was the person who most knew the significance of the cross in its very structure and weight as a physical object. And I started to get romantic about this and to think, well, what must it have meant for Jesus to have had this vocation when, of course, there's so many other vocations? And I thought he could have been a gardener, for instance. And then I stopped and thought, wait a minute, of course Jesus was a gardener.
Yes, of course he was.
He had a garden.
That's right.
The family at Nazareth and going on always would have been growing food, because this wasn't considered until very recently some kind of option.
That's right. There
were
no Krogers.
Up until not so very many years ago, to say I am a farmer was the equivalent to saying I am a human being. Right? There was nobody whose job it was to provide for you or your family. There was no, there were, up until within the last several hundred years, there was no way to ship food or store it that way. So yeah, sure, commodities, grain ships coming into Rome. We know that part. Sure. But those were the exceptions that sort of proved the rule.
And if
everybody else was growing their own food,
you didn't continue.
You didn't
to
last
exist.
for very long,
That's
right?
Well, or I was going to say the other thing is you were a slave, which is to say you depended on,
Right, although even the slaves would have been used largely in the capacity of farmer, farm labor.
Right.
But to take personal concern for the conservation of soil and the production of food from that soil has been the human vocation. Relative to this presentation for the St. Basil Institute, I was going back to Genesis chapter 1 and just refreshing my memory as to exactly what are the terms and exactly when are we given our mandate, and reflecting on the fact that in the garden before the fall, when we have a tendency to think of our children's Bible, and the sort of perfect picture of everybody, all the animals and the two humans, in states of total rest in this, sort of blasé middle class sort of garden,
Mm-hmm.
they've been given the order to till the earth, subdue it, have dominion. I can't remember what the third term is. Keep.
Yeah.
And keep.
Keep the animals.
And of course, I'm not telling you anything you don't know better than I do, at least from the academic end, the studied end. This is the fulfillment of who they are,
Right.
Adam and Eve. It's also the fulfillment of all of the other living creatures
As you were
on the
saying
planet.
in our last, the perfection.
That's right.
Of,
they
right.
want to be perfected. And
Right.
The urban garden is a perfect place for people to find that out. Sean sometimes says, how do you read the Psalms if you've never farmed?
Yeah, right.
But if you've gardened, you begin to have that same sense of our membership in the whole creation and our almost complete lack of control.
But the other thing, so just prior to this podcast, you were sharing with us that you've been growing,
Mm-hmm.
and you think you grew about a month's worth of food. It's fascinating to discover two things. One, that I can do that.
Yeah.
And two, how little land it actually takes to grow that much of your food.
Yeah, no, it's incredible, especially given the choices that you might make. So when you choose to really grow what you eat, and then you also choose high yield vegetables,
That's right.
and learn to love them.
That's
Mhm,
right.
mhm.
We say
Then you
grow
can-
what you're going to eat.
Right, but sometimes I found that squash, for instance,
Mhm.
is an obvious great use of space in terms of a real yield of vegetable.
All right.
I mean, you can and
If it's growing
last,
up
they
your
keep so
fences,
long.
that's right.
Right.
We're
But-
still
What
eating
kind of squash did you grow?
Well, spaghetti.
Uh-huh.
But then I was thinking actually about the squash you gave me.
All right.
Oh, the
Tromboncino.
tromboncino. Uh-huh.
Yeah, we called it the tuba squash because it
That's
Right,
right.
right.
That's right.
wrapped around my almost 2-year-old.
Mhm.
I mean, it was amazing about that squash was that it just won't go away. I keep on making meals out of it, hacking off another piece of it.
That's
And
right.
It's still there. It's more of a
Yes.
problem than anything else. It's like I have to defeat this squash because it lasted all through the winter
Yes.
with no refrigeration.
That's
nothing
right.
like
Right.
that.
It's a really good store.
But I think sometimes when we think of gardens, we're very habituated to just think of tomatoes, and then that can be
Right.
overwhelming because then we end up with what I mean to say is, I guess I'm trying to say a lot of things at once. I should probably do it in order. Number one, because we have the grocery system and because cash is still holding us up, right,
Mhm.
there's a certain lack of necessity to
Right.
gardening.
Absolutely.
What this requires is that for people thinking about starting a garden and actually living out the idea that they are first dependent on God and then on anything else, requires them to actually enter into a state of sort of theatrical necessity. I don't mean this in a
that.
diminished way. I mean to say, like, the reason that I grow squash is not because I'm sitting there teeth chattering about the
Pining
end of the
for
world
squash.
and-
Oh,
or
gotcha.
that
Or pining
I'm
for
certainly not
squash.
pining for squash. I had to got to throw a lot of garlic in there to really make it pop.
Mhm.
But it's because I don't trust the grocery system. So what I'm saying is, some people think like, well, I'm going to because I can rely on this cash system, I don't really need to rely on any kind of degree of sustenance. Maybe it'd be good for me to learn the principles right?
Mhm. Mhm.
But it seems to me the wrong attitude, which is that every act of reliance on the grocery system is always re-cementing its values
Yes.
within you. And you're also in a constant state of anxiety that you don't even know about. I mean, Aquinas, when he talks about anxiety, says that it's a fear, the object of which you cannot name. And I think that a lot of people live in this condition where they understand, well, this is all dependent on everything working out on a highly complex system that's for the profit of other people who don't necessarily have my concern in mind.
Mhm.
And gee, I hope it works out. But of course, they don't think this every time they go to the grocery store. Why would you?
Right.
Instead, it's just this anxious feeling, this
That's right.
malaise
Mhm.
that kind of becomes almost, I think, civilizational. And I think the first thing to realize is that when you practice traditional, like the tradition of gardening, you're exiting from that to whatever degree you can. You're saying no to that fear and that anxiety and starting to spiritually connect with what it is like to have that tilling and keeping as your vocation, that care. So, because sometimes this can get confused, I think, with the prepper thing, right? People hear that I'm trying to grow as much food so I can eat off just my land, and they think that I have some psychotic fear that I need to provide for myself quickly because the world's going to end.
And some illusion that somehow, if that were to happen, you could stay safe on your little 10th of an acre and eat your food undisturbed, or whatever silly idea they have.
Yeah, it's just that I think it is a value in itself to trust in God rather than princes, and that comes from the Psalms, that principle of trusting in God and trusting in princes. And I think that
little piece of humor, my 1963 breviary on page, I don't know what, but it's in the second week, you know, it says trust in God rather than in prices.
That's good.
Little aside, that's
the other thing I was thinking though was Christianity always begins today. That sounds like a cliche, I suppose, something you might hear in a homily, which is how you know
that's
it's
a pretty
bad.
good line, though. I'll deal with that.
Good.
There's a lot of things in this world that begin tomorrow, that begin when we have enough money, that begin when we take over the government and can really start enacting things, you know.
Right.
But Christianity saves our souls, so it's always present to us right where we are.
The other thing we would maybe add to that is it begins with me.
Right.
And this is one thing that Beth and I constantly are coming back to, because people say, we've got global warming, we've got all these disasters, and
we need mandates.
The solution is not
movements.
advocacy. The solution is not the government. The solution is, what am I going to do about that
right now? So Christianity begins today, exactly the way we would say to people, "What can you do?" Those would be our important words.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, right. I mean, Christianity begins today, and so Christianity is fitting for human practices that are gradated all the way from the bottom to the top, because it never says, oh, once you are 18, then you will be able to be a Christian, right? It has this salvation. That's why we baptize infants. I mean, my goodness. You can be born 3 months early and we'll still get the holy water on you. Why? Because at no moment in human life is the operation of grace not already pulling you up to heaven. And so the kinds of practices that Christianity have historically valued have been things that are always participatable differently, but at every level of existence. Now, gardening, and I think if you look to the Middle Ages, you can see a certain perfection of this, the idea of the master-apprentice system within every trade. There was always the idea that, yeah, of course, you don't trust the child with this level of participation, but there wasn't this sense of like, once you're 18, then the real world suddenly begins. Like you just hit a button. Okay. So with gardening, though, I think there is a just wonderful. Probably it's not even a good example. Probably it is the example, or rather, everything else is an example of gardening, where right from the beginning, children can participate. Right from the beginning, you can begin.
Father can work with child. Where I have a job that I go off. I leave the home and I go do this thing, whatever it is.
For cash.
Yes. My children cannot participate in that for a very long time.
I was thinking of you mentioned this, and then I thought of Bring Your Child to Work Day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is like
how about bring the work home day?
Right. Bring the work to the child day.
Bring the dad home day.
That's right. That's right.
So
so I was thinking about this and what you're talking about, and we just gave a talk locally on urban gardening. And at the heart of it, at the core of it, fertility. And, in some sense, it's biblical that we, in becoming Christian, it's fertility. And what is fertility? Maybe in Christianity it's praying or it's something else. But for us...
the thing that makes the soil productive.
Yeah. And you cannot... one thing that we say is that if you put in your garden... Maybe for 3 years, you will be a remarkable gardener. The 4th year, if you have not been adding fertility back in, you are a terrible gardener because it is not going to grow. But you have to keep adding back in manure or fertility of some sort, and it is that adding back in, again, uh, the parables talk about this. Jesus talks about this. This you've got to have fertility, and maybe prayer is our fertility, Christian fertility. I'm not sure, but
it seems like most people, when they think of gardening, immediately think of the fruit. So they think of gardening means that this thing I buy, I'm going to get through my own labor. And so immediately gardening poses itself as a unnecessary addition, right? Like, well, if I can get it this way why do I do this new involved way?
Right.
I love the way you describe it, Sean. To think of the gardener as the one who brings fertility to soil first. And what that does is it becomes realistic. Like, that's actually how you garden well. But B, it puts fruit, produce, in its right relation, right? Which is not that you're somehow artificially trying to create the conditions where you can get to this object. Rather, you're tending the nature of the soil, which is what the plant needs, and then the fruit comes and it seems like a gift. I think everyone who's gardened, or even just that first thing you grow in a pot, has sensed the absolute non-identity between what they put into it and what they get out of it.
The gratuitousness
right.
of the
yeah.
thing.
Right. And then I thought where you were going at one point earlier in this conversation was that the tomato, I'm going to plant a tomato, and then I'm kind of overwhelmed with tomatoes. I didn't know if that was where you were going. Because that is certainly with milk, with the cow, you got all this milk, and now what do we do with it? Yeah. But that's just being creative, because if you were to suddenly get this tremendous number of tomatoes, then you've got salsa, and you've got... Right. Such a variety. Then you have the next problem of how do I put this up? How do I, for future use?
Well, it goes back to something we've spoken of, that when you decide to garden in any little capacity, what it immediately does is it opens your mind to a whole way of life that's implied in gardening. So we talked about this with chickens. Like, if you just keep a few chickens, you realize what they're good at and what they do. You suddenly realize that man was meant to have more land.
Right.
Because okay, and so in a similar sense with our consumption, when you grow a vegetable, thinking I'm going to get the thing that I use for putting on my hamburger, and suddenly you have 346 of them.
That's right. That's right.
Then you realize that in the nature of the plant itself is an expansive life that's possible, right? A life that must involve preservation, right?
Right.
And if it involves preservation, then it involves people getting together to preserve things together. That must involve sharing and giving, right? That must involve a multitude, a diversity of a cuisine. Okay, so what I'm saying is, and I think what people probably understand by now, is just that the reason a garden is a revolutionary act is because it is not just a seed you're planting in the soil, it's a seed you're planting in your soul simultaneously, which allows you to envision a world in which, well, if gardening was allowed to do what it seems to want to do, which is to provide humans with an abundance on a cyclically refertilized land, then there is a complete social order that is implied. Like, what makes that possible? So that's why I say it's spiritually valuable. It's just because it's always teaching you about what the kingdom of God is like, even as you're just...
So we can tie it back to something you said in passing, which was you get a few chickens and you realize what chickens do, what they can do, what they do well. And so another way to put that would be to say that you begin to identify something about the nature of chicken. And the same thing happens when you plant that tomato seed or put your seedling in the ground, and suddenly you have all these tomatoes. One of the reasons why gardening is so significant, it's the seed of farming. The garden is the seed of farming. And Albert Howard observed that. Alan Nation observed that.
What do you mean by that? So
I
take it to mean that, if you go to any homestead that's imitating what you guys are writing about in the book Floating Above Your Heads, you're going to find the farm and the garden. But the garden will be closer to the house. The garden will be this sort of...
Well, what a lot of people have meant by it, Rodale, for example, is that people start out gardening. Say you wake up one morning in spring and you say, this year I'm going to plant a garden. I've got, that little space of dirt next to the house. I'm going to put vegetables in there. That seed that you've planted in yourself in the soil is going to change the way you think about the creation. Mm-hmm. You're going to see it as abundant, mm-hmm. as gift, but you're also very specifically going to come to, who didn't dream as a child, right? That you could talk to and communicate with your dog, mm-hmm. or a flying horse, or a dragon, or whatever your thing was that was like, that piercing need that we have to touch a non-human living thing, mm-hmm. in a way that's intimate and goes both ways. Mm-hmm. And we all have that desire. And when you begin to garden or keep a chicken or both, then you begin the path that takes you there. And that path does lead toward farming, because the more you do it, the less it feels like my weird hobby, or my cool hobby or whatever, but this thing that's been added on to me, right. This unnecessary thing that I have annexed to myself. And the more you realize this defines me. Mm-hmm. I am, as a human being, I am a farmer. And Genesis 1, what is our mandate? The only one he gives us really is that vis-a-vis this world full of living things, we're to bring order and plenty, superabundance, mm-hmm. And beauty out of it. And those are all the things that a gardener, that's gardening. You take these little seeds and you put them in the ground and things happen, and maybe it's a mess and maybe it's beautiful, but it comes together into this abundance that you didn't have before. And then the next time you do it, you have a little bit better of an idea of how to put it together. And as Sean says, if you want to keep doing it, pretty soon have to figure out how to return all the, I hate the word waste. Nothing is waste unless we make it so, but return all of the material back to the soil in some way, like with your chickens, right? Chickens eat it. Chickens make eggs. Chicken make compost. Compost goes back to the garden, and we have more. Yeah. And so that the experience of gardening is the beginning of the discovery on a very real level. And for me, as a convert to the faith, as adult trained farmers, this is a very real experience that I can trace, in my own history, of discovering what it is to be human. What is our call?
And you just said, again, this is in our conversation prior to the podcast. You said, I've grown about a month's worth of stuff. And you didn't say, half, he said. Yes. And you didn't just say, oh, well, I've done that and I don't even want to do that again, right? Or you didn't also say, next year I'm going to grow another month and a half. You said, I'm going to grow more, and I'm going to do more beds this time, and I'm going to do more, because this is really exciting. It is. The thought of raising this with my family, so that our family is not just a consumer family, but we are now a producing family. And I'm going to be able to do this with my children. And we are going to provide our food. And we're not going to make money out of it. And we don't care if we make money out of it. Yeah. We are going to provide ourselves with the best food. And then the going back becomes very hard. So that then you go to Kroger's and you get their styrofoam tomato and you say, oh my gosh, I can't eat this.
Well, that's the first step too. There is a scary step that comes to the point where you really can't eat it.
Yeah.
As you eat more home produced food, you see yourself homeopathic doses of toxic stuff that we call food preservatives, right? Mm-hmm. And homeopathic doses of other stuff like glyphosate. You stop eating them, you lose your resistance. So you really do get to the point where even the smell will make you sick. That's unpleasant, but it is real. So you walk into a restaurant, you think, can't eat here.
Sure. My first experience of gardening, or what it seemed to mean to grow a single thing, was courage. Fearlessness, because the verse, of course, consider the lilies of the field, Well, I didn't consider the lilies per se, but I considered like the tomatoes,
Mm-hmm.
and the principle seemed to be the same, which is that if creation is such that one seed produces enough to plant a field,
Mm-hmm.
then what is at the beating heart of it all is that no one has to be afraid. That the only question is how are we going to respond to the superabundant gift that is a creation. It is not a question of whether the creation is sufficient and whether we are sufficient for it. You know, it's funny because the first time I started collecting seeds from the garden, I was such a miser about it. No, I mean it. Like my sense was scarce. Like
Yes, right.
you describe a world when you describe kindly my gardening back to me that has nothing whatsoever to do with scarcity or fear. Mm-hmm. It only means that secondarily. Primarily, I would do this if it were the kingdom of heaven. I would still garden and still eat.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay, but we do have a world of sin. And I don't think I realized how much I had a mind that was conditioned by the overwhelming fear of scarcity, which includes the fear that maybe this world is it, and I have to carve out the best possible life, until I was dealing with seeds. And I was buying these little containers to start these seeds, and I was literally counting up the seeds of one tomato and saying, okay, well, I'm going to need 630 containers so that I don't waste any one of these seeds. That was my first impulse. Uh-huh. And I even still do this sometimes, where if I get a little seed packet, it's got 250 seeds, and I'm there, my kid is spraying 168 onions, which is more reasonable than what I've previously tried to do. Uh-huh. But the sense is that creation gives abundantly. We have to just let it go.
That's right.
And choose what we want out of that abundance. And then the idea that we can manage it becomes, especially if you consider 3 tomatoes, for instance, becomes totally untenable. And it's because we are dealing with a world in which there is no waste. And so when we bring to it the world of human artifice, our machine world, and then we try to impose it on the garden, we start looking for, the presumption is if I don't manage it all meticulously, I'm going to waste.
Right.
But what nature says is there is just too much here.
Yeah.
To even bring that attitude to bear on it. And that's what gardening, I think, taught me kind of on a
it's funny because we are formed. So if you think about the average human being in, say, the United States of America and his experience from cradle to, hopefully not to grave, but, say you're 30 now, the vast 99.999% of your time has been spent in contact with, in sight of, working with, playing with human artifacts. And human artifacts are non-living. They're non-self-reproducing. They're non-self-healing.
They do not carry their seed within their fruit.
That's right. And so, and they are, by definition, they are finite in a way that living things are, as you have expressed, like ebulliently abundant, right? Just overflowing. And but we function as people in a zero-sum game. Yep. More for you, less for me picture. And that's how we respond in the beginning as we begin to, sort of try and steward living things. We remember it a lot because when we first went from dairy goats to dairy cows, we began to have way more milk. Yeah. And, modern Americans think of milk as this thing that comes in units. It's in white jugs. They cost so much a gallon. You do certain things with it. And we were getting buckets and buckets in the front door. And at that point, we already knew quite a bit about how useful milk is on the farm. But it was funny how much struggle there was within us to make ourselves use that superabundance in the ways dictated by nature, by the very nature of the things we're farming with. So you bring in milk, you let it cool, you skim the cream off, you use that for your coffee and to make butter. You now have skim milk, which you can cook with, or day 2, you've got way too much of it, feed it to the pigs. Wow. And you have to force yourself to do that because in the back of your head, something's going cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. Yeah, right. But it's you learn to respond to now, you talked about, again, knowing what chickens do well. You begin to get, in 25 years, 30 years, we have just the inkling of what are the natures of all these different living things. And because of, as soon as I sort of begin to discern their natures, I can begin to see, where do you fit into this living organism that is a farm? And so how do I direct things to make it more abundant? So for you, you've been doing it as long as I've known you, or almost, because you've had a compost heap.
Yeah.
Right.
And then you've used that compost heap, you build a compost heap, and next year you move whatever you had surrounded the compost heap with somewhere else, make a new compost heap, and you go back to point A and you plant stuff in it because you've added fertility, and now it's going to be the best garden on the place. And then after a year or something, you bump that one up, you raised it to another level by putting chickens in your compost pile. And now you're harvesting eggs from your kitchen waste that then become chickens who make compost, who make a better garden.
Yeah.
And there's no, it's exponential,
No, it really is. And the net effect has been that there's no category of waste anymore.
That's right.
Or rather, the only waste that my household is involved in is the crap that people keep making. I don't know why everyone keeps wrapping everything I need in plastic.
Oh,
yeah,
yes, right.
Right,
That's
just
right.
like that.
That's right.
But in terms of what we are working on, the category is gone, and there's a joy in scraping a plate and saying to the chickens,
Absolutely,
That's right.
absolutely.
That's
That thing. So in our house, honestly, you rinse certain jars out, milk, tomato sauce, whatever, and it goes in the bucket under the sink for the pigs. So you get to the point where it's automatic. This, last little bit of coffee with cream in it goes right into the bucket.
Yeah.
The pigs are they're going to be glad,
It's a
even if
libation.
it wasn't even. Yes, exactly, because it's for happiness. They will be happy about it. They like sloppy food. It isn't even any longer cha-ching in the back of my head as I'm, sort of moving things around to where they will be the most productive. It's what makes it more beautiful, what makes it happier, what makes it appropriate.
Now, what kills this, and again, we're starting to talk a little bit about farm, but I think we have the same thing with gardens, is if the only way to get my fertility or any of those things is through cash. So that I go to Lowe's and I buy fertilizer and I do those things.
Yeah.
But that does, and then it becomes either the wife's or the husband's hobby, and the other person is spending money or seeing money being spent toward this little hobby that you have, and it becomes a source of frustration because why is this money? And what we are so excited about in the way that we farm and garden is we have found ways to do that without spending cash. That there is a natural way of doing all this, of developing fertility and stuff like that without money.
Right. You walk into Lowe's Garden Center and you see
the
little corners for the raised beds and the expensive boards for the raised beds and the expensive stuff to go in the raised beds. And it makes me think Wendell is saying, the commercial way is to take a solution and neatly split it into two problems, both of which are lucrative.
Yes, right. Absolutely. No, that is modernity in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, listen, I think that we set out to talk about how to have a backyard garden in the manner you're describing, and we successfully failed to talk about how to have a backyard garden.
You want to drag it to
but
that?
Instead, we talked about why to have one, and I don't want to drag it out. I want to end our discussion here with some final reflections, and then I'd like to start a new discussion about the hows.
Okay.
So this is on the fly editing. We have decided the title, why to have a backyard
Why to have
garden,
a backyard garden.
or any garden at all.
To be human.
So that's the why. That's what I was going to say. If you maybe an ending reflection on if someone is on the fence about this and doesn't need to be convinced in terms of maybe the material cost or something, but just why to do it. Period. What do you tell them?
Well, again, to me, it comes back to learning. I mean, you will learn an awful lot about theology through doing this. I think and I also think it's the right thing to do. That's one of the things that we come back to. Yeah. It's the next right thing to do.
You do it because it's right. Yeah. Although I think bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches are a really good second on why.
Yeah. No, I always find that I have to be motivated by the absolute first in order to then
the rightness.
Just why do this? I mean, human life is so wonderful, and so incredible and such a gift. Why do anything that doesn't attain its end, right? And I do think, I know its end is life with God. And we are finally recovering from a sort of Greco-Roman tradition, which is very unfortunate, not even consistent within that tradition, of this castigation of all labor as being fit for slaves. That has been deep in our psyche, even in the Christian tradition. There's like healing that needs to come for the Christian tradition, for the way that they've taken it up into itself, precisely to redeem it. But anyways, this view that life is all about getting away from that work so that we can enjoy contemplation, which is defined almost in its opposition to the active life and to labor. And if anything, what gardening shows me, and especially in your lives, is that it is a form of contemplation, and not by being like an airy version of itself, not because like when you go out there with the vegetables, you're somehow kind of imposing a contemplative spirit onto the activity, but in the fulfillment of man's original vocation to till and keep the earth and make of it a pleasing offering to God. Gardening is a primary, what the tradition comes back to again and again is what is wisdom that we're all supposed to seek. And it is knowledge of the nature of reality, of the nature of things. So the attainment of wisdom can never be contemplative in the sense of an opposition to that deep contact with the nature of things that comes from touching them, from knowing them. And so I think that it is worthwhile to garden for that reason, but then also to have the most primary and most accessible metaphor for everything else you do in life. How do you understand parenting without gardening? How do you understand as a priest your nurture of souls without gardening? How do you understand your job, right? No matter what it is, without understanding the returning of fertility to where it came from, the raising up of fruit that is given super abundantly. It seems to be like to take away gardening from the life of the human person seems to be to take away that focal point that helps us to understand everything else and to give us the language for speaking.
Why were the parables always farming?
Well, and honestly, ourselves as members of a human race that goes back to Adam and Eve, if we don't garden, if we are content to live in a human construct world, we don't really have much in common with the vast majority of human beings. Those that don't get to vote, the dead ones.
Yeah. Well, there it is. I guess that's our why for gardening, and next time we will give you some of the how.
Cheerio.
Till next time.